Forum 2020. We are pleased to introduce the President of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, Dr. Karen Donfried.
Welcome to Brussels Forum 2020, our 15th edition. We are now closing out week 3 of our virtual programming, and I am delighted to have all of you tuning in for what I know is going to be the highlight of my week, a conversation with leader Stacey Abrams. Let me begin by recognizing our partners who make Brussels Forum possible. Our founding partners, Daimler and the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, our forum partner, Deloitte, and all of our associate, supporting, and knowledge partners. Thank you all. And a very special thanks to leader Stacey Abrams for joining me for a conversation about American leadership in the world. It is a privilege for many reasons to host her, but for me as president of GMF, one reason is that Stacey Abrams' status as an alumna of GMF's Marshall Memorial Fellowship, a transatlantic leadership development program GMF has invested in for almost 40 years, is at the top of my list. Stacey Abrams, welcome back to GMF.
Thank you for having me.
I should also mention that Leader Abrams is a New York Times bestselling author, including her new book, Our Time Is Now. She's a serial entrepreneur, she's a nonprofit CEO, she's a political leader, having served for 11 years in the Georgia House of Representatives, including 7 as Democratic leader. In 2018, she became the Democratic nominee for governor of Georgia, winning more votes than any other Democrat in the state's history. She has achieved many firsts. The first Black woman to become the gubernatorial nominee for a major party in the US, the first Black woman and first Georgian to deliver a response to the State of the Union. And Leader Abrams, I am certain there are many more firsts to come. To all of you who are listening, I encourage you to send in questions using Twitter. The hashtag is Brussels Forum, or by emailing brusselsforum@gmfus.org. So Twitter using the hashtag Brussels Forum, or email brusselsforum@gmfus.org. Leader Abrams, we're having this conversation on June 19th, called Juneteenth, a day that marks and celebrates the end of slavery here in the United States. Today, protests are planned in cities across the country to demonstrate against racism and police brutality and advance calls for policy changes. Leader Abrams, it feels particularly significant for GMF to be hosting you on the Brussels Forum stage on Juneteenth, a day that carries powerful resonance about America's ongoing struggle or quest for justice and equality for all of our citizens. What is the significance of Juneteenth for you? Did you celebrate Juneteenth growing up? Share with us the resonance of this day.
Juneteenth, well, first I want to say thank you, Karen, for having me. Thank you to GMF for hosting me today, and thank you to all who are listening. Juneteenth is known as the Day of Jubilee. It's the 155th anniversary this year. But I do want to caution us, we use it as a marker, not simply of the end of slavery, but actually as the moment where the last community was told that slavery was ending. But the challenge of Juneteenth is that it didn't actually mark the end of slavery. It marked the beginning of emancipation for the world to know, for Blacks in America to know that their emancipation was coming. But like so many of the moments of progress in our country, the announcement often, long precedes the actuality. And I think as we look to this moment, what we're facing is that once again, we are having the conversation about what should be true. We are delivering this moment into our history, but we know that the work is going to have to continue. Much like those in Galveston, Texas, who learned on this day that the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed and that they were, in theory, free. The reality of achieving that freedom was going to require more work, more effort. those who were responsible for their protection and for their emancipation were going to balk at their obligations. And as we think about what's happened to George Floyd, to Ahmaud Arbery, to Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, to Rayshard Brooks, and to the litany of names that have become so long that most human memory can't hold them all, we have to remember that what happened in 1865 did not end the challenges of America. It didn't end the challenge of the dehumanization of Blacks. It didn't end the use of force to compel behavior. And in fact, part of what's wrapped into this conversation about extrajudicial killings and police brutality is the nature that the police had in the South as a slave revolt force. Their job was to go and capture escaping slaves. And so what I ask people to think about is that even as we celebrate the 155th anniversary of a moment that is indeed a day of jubilee, a day of celebration, that America in that moment acknowledged one of its most fundamental and original sins, that we are still paying the price and we are still trying to actually become the nation we declared ourselves to be in our Declaration of Independence, but that our Constitution did not fully recognize and still continues to grapple with.
That's such a powerful point, and your personal history is so connected with this fight for greater justice and equality for all Americans. And I think when Americans hear the name Stacey Abrams, we think of the many critical issues related to our domestic politics that you champion, whether it's combating the undercount of minority communities in the 2020 census or voter suppression. But I have to say, I was really struck when I was preparing for this conversation with you, when I read an article in Rolling Stone magazine that you participated in a few months ago, and you were asked what you wish more people knew about you. And you pointed to your foreign policy experience. And last month, I read an article that you wrote in Foreign Affairs that you called American Leadership Begins at Home, the global imperative to rebuild governance and restore democracy. And in that piece, you argue, this is your first line, I'm going to quote, America's leadership on the global stage has always been grounded not only in the power of our ideals, but also in the power of our example. So you connect the domestic reality of the United States with our foreign policy reach. Can you just share with our audience that argument, build out that argument for us?
Sure. My introduction to foreign policy, beyond the couple of courses I took with Dr. Shafi at Spelman College, my engagement in the conversation of foreign policy actually began during a summer program where I met my dear friend, Will Dobson. We were not friends at first. We had very diametrically opposed ideas in some ways, but one thing he challenged me on was this argument I made that the primacy of domestic policy pushed out of my realm of interest foreign policy. I read The Economist, I watched the news, but it seemed to me that foreign policy was a diversion from the work I was committed to, which was domestic policy. And what he said to me and what he challenged me on was that how would I be an effective domestic leader if I did not understand the world that we are a part of, but more importantly, the world that America sought in so many ways to serve as a moral example to? That caught my attention. It also chafed at my nerves because I didn't want him to be right. And so I began my own exploration of foreign policy. I started in graduate school by working as a research assistant and a writer on a piece on the redemocratization of Brazil. I started with the Salzburg seminars, and of course was able to continue my tutelage through the Marshall Memorial Fellowship. The reason I pointed that out to the reporter was that I've been very concerted since the age of 21 to build a capacity to understand how effective we can be here is driven by how we serve in this global society. What is central to America's identity in this moment, and has been for the last 75 years, has been our willingness to not only stand as a moral leader, but also as an example of competence. We have argued that it is our ability to meet the crises, not only here, but abroad, that has led us to assume the title of superpower. It's not simply our military might. It's not simply our economic prowess. It is our ability to offer, by example, leadership and competence that demonstrates that when compared to authoritarian regimes, when compared to autocracy, that the stability and the utility of democracies is why we should have this rise. But what we have seen in the last 14 years is a diminution of the number of democracies. Freedom House has said that for the 14th year in a row, liberal democracies have declined. But at the same time, in the minute of COVID-19, what we are seeing is that the United States in particular has fumbled in its response and has abandoned its obligation to demonstrate competence, particularly when we think about the rising capacity of China, not simply as a global leader on the economy and a global leader in producing technology and products, but also their humanitarian efforts in Africa and in South America, in Central America. We have to be very intentional about how democracy is seen, and the United States has a moral obligation to restore our capacity. But we also have the human obligation to keep our people alive. And the fumbling that we have seen that has been broadcast around the world, the incompetence of the Trump administration's response to this disease calls to mind how important it is for us to not only talk about what we should be, but to demonstrate it through word and deed. I was struck by this sort of a through line that while the United States was fumbling on a federal level in the response to COVID-19, you saw mayors and governors have to step up and provide these services to push back against this diminishment of who we are and the service that we needed to provide in both a public health crisis and an economic collapse. But it draws to mind for me the Pact of Free Cities that was signed by the mayors of Warsaw and Bratislava, of Prague and of Warsaw, where they said that in their nations, where autocracy is unfortunately making strong advances, that it was their responsibility as the leader of these free cities to show the competence of democracy, to show the liberal order continues. And so for me, the through line is it's not enough to say we are a liberal democracy. It is not enough to say that we believe in our people. We have to demonstrate it. Because the other underlying theme that is so disturbing to me, and this goes back to your first question about Juneteenth, the disproportionate effect of COVID-19 has been on communities of color. The governor of New Mexico had to plead on national television for service to the Navajo Nation, which at one point had the third highest rate of infection and disease of COVID disease. Black people are dying at a higher rate disproportionate to our population. And we are seeing a rise in the infection rate among Latinos now. And those pieces also speak to how we see minority rights. And again, the United States' remarkable indifference to those challenges undermine our ability on an international level to talk about minority rights and to talk about the primacy of democracy when it fails the very people who are the most vulnerable, the least resilient, and the most reliant on democracy's success.
So thank you. That was a really powerful rendering of the argument in your article. And it captures another line that was in that article where you said, the greatest challenge to liberal democracy today comes not from overseas, but from domestic dysfunction. And I want to take us now to your perspective on that domestic dysfunction. There's a real sense, and you just alluded to it, that the protests today are different than what we've seen in recent years. And there seems to be a sense that these are not demonstrations that are just going to peter out, but that really we're seeing a movement underway that will lead to lasting change. And as you pointed out, there's a real intersection between this pandemic of COVID-19, the pandemic of racism, and then a president who many would argue is focusing more on division than on uniting Americans. But I really would love your sense of what is different today and why is it different?
So my participation in demonstration and activism began at the cradle. My parents were civil rights activists as teenagers, and they raised us with this notion and this obligation to not simply bemoan your fate, but to work to change your fate. They were involved in the civil rights movement. They took us out to protest. And when I was a student at Spelman College in 1992, I was one of the leaders of the protest in response to the Rodney King verdict. I understood in that moment how critical it was to lift up not simply the police brutality that went unpunished, but to have this broader conversation about youth poverty and about the violence that was visited upon our communities with impunity. It was in the midst of a presidential election. We were in the beginning of a primary, and in the end, the nominee for president was not held to account. The presidential candidates were not held in post-election time to meet the moment that had begun with Rodney King, except to crack down on what they saw as riot, to crack down on what they saw as disreputable protest, as opposed to being forced to confront the underlying systemic racism in our justice system. What's different today is, one, the consistency of the demonstration, but also the responsiveness that we're seeing from levels of government saying that we see you and we hear you. And that happens in part because we are at a demographic inflection point, not only in the United States, but around the world. Part of the challenges we're seeing with autocratic governments in Europe, it comes about because of those cities that I mentioned that are more multi-ethnic, more diverse, and that diversity challenges the notion of what it means to be a nation, what it means to have a central homogenous identity. And in the United States, what is so different today than 20 years ago, 30 years ago, is that the composition of our country is different. The people who can demand action are different. Those able to vote into power or to vote out of power is different. And that is why I think we see such a stark difference between what preceded and what is happening today. The other piece of it is that it has been a rare occasion that we have had someone occupying the White House who has been such a stark example of the divisiveness and the racial attitudes that are the enemy of justice. Whether he does it intentionally or by benign neglect, Donald Trump has articulated a frame and has supported behaviors that undercut every notion of social justice that we should hold to be true. And by having such a stark example occupying the highest levels of government, I think the urgency of the moment is much more acute. Despite what happened in the 1990s, the argument between George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, while important to those of us who cared about that moment, there was not this stark notion that George H.W. Bush was seen as a purveyor of neo-Nazism and a supporter of the kind of violent response that we have seen. And while I cannot attribute to Donald Trump exactly what his motives are, I can tell you what his behaviors are. And that stark responsibility is what is driving people to say that not only must we demand it, we must continue to demand it because the consequences are very clear. We have lived through 4 years of those consequences. We cannot afford 4 more.
And I've heard you speak before about our need to get the infrastructure of democracy to work. And you've set up various nonprofits to do that work. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell us in particular about Fair Fight and the goals of Fair Fight that you see as pivotal to the future of democracy in the US.
When I did not become governor of Georgia, and I'm very aware that I'm not, part of my responsibility, and I've always seen it as such, it is insufficient to say that unless I have this platform, I cannot do the work. And so whether I was in office or not, I've always seen my obligation to try to build systems and structures that respond to the inconsistencies and the infirmities that I see in how we achieve social justice. I created the New Georgia Project in 2013 and 2014 to tackle the issue of voter registration, which is the entry point for participation in our democracy in the United States. And while that has gone extraordinarily well and is now its own independent organization, it was insufficient in 2018 to meet the moment of the collapse of our voting apparatus. The voter suppression that we saw exemplified in Georgia didn't simply exist in Georgia, but I think that my opponent in the race, who was the Secretary of State, was one of the architects of modern day voter suppression, in that he used every lever possible to block and create barriers for voters, whether it was purging 1.4 million voters, overseeing the shutdown of 214 precincts, which, according to independent analysis, barred between 54 and 85,000 people from casting their ballots. He held hostage the voter registration of 53,000 people, 80% of whom were people of color. And he undertook, over the course of his tenure over 8 years, remarkably aggressive actions against particularly communities of color seeking to engage in the right to vote. And so in the aftermath of the election, my responsibility, as I saw it, was, if I could not serve in the job of governor and do the work that I sought, I needed to focus on the work that needed to be done to shore up the voices of and the participation in our democracy. Because fundamentally, democracy isn't partisan. It is a process. And that process should be open equally to anyone who is entitled to participation. And while it has taken us more than 2 centuries to understand what participation in America should look like, we have the framework. And so Fair Fight Action, which is our C4, and Fair Fight 2020, which is our political work, looks to say in the United States, particularly in battleground states that both change the electoral outcomes, but also are purveyors sometimes of the most egregious forms of voter suppression, that we have an affirmative obligation to identify what that suppression looks like, use litigation, legislation, and advocacy to challenge it, but to also arm community members and citizens with a full understanding and ability to execute their rights. We aren't going to dismantle voter suppression in a single election, but the first point of entry in a democracy is ensuring that eligible citizens know what their rights are and have access to their rights. Because the power of voting is not just transformative, it is essential. It is in a democracy, it is the only power citizens hold to voice their opinions in ways that can actually change the outcomes. Protests are extraordinarily important in the streets, but protest at the ballot box it's a cementing of those moments. It is an auditable way to say, this is what we declared we want to see. And it's the way that we can peacefully overthrow a government that is not responsive to our needs.
So that was really interesting, because the question that I was going to ask you, but you just answered it, is I've been intrigued by the juxtaposition in your life of the fact that you are both an activist, so an outsider, but you're also a political insider, given your time in the Georgia House. And this belief you have, the political change results from both protest and participation. And you captured it really beautifully there. So take what you've just said and tell us, what are the lessons that you learned from last week's primary election in Georgia? On the one hand, it was messy. On the other hand, Georgia Democrats set a new record for voter turnout. So what did we learn last week?
So there are 2 things. One is that when you break the machinery of democracy targeting some, you eventually break it for everyone. While African-American communities, Latino communities, Asian Pacific Islander communities in Georgia have long faced the challenges of voter suppression for the last decade or so in the state of Georgia, what usually happened was it was a concentrated problem. It was 8-hour lines if you were Black. It was being turned away from being able to participate if you were a naturalized citizen. It was the rejection of your absentee ballots if you 2 times more likely if you were a person of color, 5 times more likely if you were a young person as a national average. Those things had been true for communities of color. It had been true for young people. It had been true for poor communities. But what happened on Tuesday was that it happened in rural enclaves that are predominantly white. It happened in wealthy enclaves that were not used to facing any of the barriers to voting. We had one precinct that had 16,000 people assigned to it in a single day. And that was one of the most diverse areas of the city, but it was also one of the wealthiest parts of Georgia. And so what we saw happen was that those who had been able to dismiss the conversation of voter suppression as simply a user error, if those people had known what to do, it would have been better, or they just didn't understand what the rules are. They were able to see in real time that the infirmities of our democracy, particularly of our voting apparatus, applied to everyone. And so I think that important note is critical. And we're seeing it play out right now in our legislature because the Speaker of the House, a Republican from North rural Georgia, his counties also had to seek the same court orders that urban Black counties did in order to extend the time to vote because of the combination of incompetence and malfeasance. But we cannot resign ourselves to these things occurring thinking, well, as long as it doesn't happen to me, it doesn't matter. Because as those cracks and fissures occur, it destroys the entire infrastructure. And what played out in Georgia on such a massive scale is happening around our country. That's why Fair Fight is in action. Because while everyone focused their attention on what happened in Georgia, in South Carolina and in Nevada on the same night, you had similar incidences of long lines, of rejection of ballots, of challenges to the access of voting. Again, more concentrated because people were trying to target communities that they did not care for having participation in our democracy, but writ large undermines the overarching experiment in our country. The second part, though, is the turnout. And that goes back to my point about the demographic inflection point that we're in. The United States is not a static country, and our democracy has never been static. You look to the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, the 26th Amendment, we have consistently had to operate to expand our perquisites of democracy to meet our promise of democracy. And at the same time, what we have seen is that whenever there is a reaction to that expansion, which is typically voter suppression, there is always a parallel increase in participation because people want what they've been promised. Voter suppression isn't an absolute. It is an activity, a series of activities that try to diminish access. But when you overwhelm the system through participation, it doesn't mean everyone gets through, but more people get through than you expected. And what we saw happen in Georgia is a record turnout, a higher record than we had in 2008, a higher record than we had in 2018. And because it is so aggressive, what we know we will see is that the composition of the electorate was motivated not only by their anger over what they see happening in the world, but by the challenges that they've seen trying to participate. And one of my missions, and I think I've been fairly successful about it, is to articulate that voter suppression is not the fault of the voter. Voter suppression is an activity of those responsible and in charge. And as I like to tell folks, the fact that you have sharks in the water, just because more people get in the water doesn't mean there are fewer sharks, but it's harder for the shark to get everything to go after. Voter suppression exists in concert with voter participation. And until we can dismantle the structure of voter suppression, we have to increase the participation to overwhelm those challenges.
All of these issues are also going to be fundamentally important when we get to the November election.
Yes.
And there are lots of aspects of that election that we could talk about. I'm going to go with the news cycle. There's, of course, been lots of buzz about who Vice President Biden is going to pick as his vice presidential candidate. You've been part of that mix. You've spoken candidly about your readiness to serve if asked. But the breaking news was Amy Klobuchar announcing that she was withdrawing her name from consideration. And what she said was, and I'm going to quote this, "After what I've seen in my state and what I've seen across the country, this is a historic moment and America must seize on this moment. I truly believe that this is a moment to put a woman of color on that ticket." Oftentimes people say, it doesn't matter who the vice presidential pick is. Does it matter, and does it need to be a woman of color, or for that matter, a Black woman, given what this country is experiencing right now?
Fundamentally, the choice about who his running mate should be and will be is the decision of Vice President Biden. I trust that he's going to make the right choice, not only to win an election, but to effectively govern our country. And I give him the greatest amount of credit for his willingness to declare early that he was going to select a woman and that he has included in consideration women of color. But I've also been very clear that I believe there are not virtue signals being sent, but incredible value signals being sent by the inclusion of women of color, particularly Black women in this moment. We have to evolve what the face of leadership looks like, because we too often use a few women as exemplars of what we've accomplished, a few people of color as models and as avatars of our progress. But until that progress is connected to power, it is fairly irrelevant to the average person. And what we have to see is that progress and power are not only connected together, but actually in a vigorous way pushed into a broader society. I believe it is a good thing if the vice president decides to pick a woman of color as his running mate. I believe it is a good thing if America and if the world sees that we no longer simply give lip service to diversity in the question of who leads our country, but having one example that we elected in 2008 in the body of President Obama is insufficient to make a strong statement of, historic change. And so I do think that it is a critical piece, but I will connect it to a larger conversation, which is that as we think about not only domestic policy, but again, our foreign presence, we have to signal that it is more than things we are calling on others to do. These are activities we are willing to engage in ourselves. And that is such a critical piece because the moral example of America is what has buoyed us for so long. We face a moment of moral crisis. We are not seen as the moral leaders we once were, but the crises that we have always been a part of solving, from communism to the fall and the collapse of economies, the global health security crises we've tried to address prior to now, each of those require that we do more than simply talk about who we are. We have to be able to demonstrate it and lead with it. And so my hope is that whatever his decision about a vice president, that the leadership team that surrounds the vice president, that the leadership team that surrounds the new president will be reflective of the needs and the values, not only of the United States, but of a broader world that's also grappling with this demographic change and the implications of those changes.
Well, and that's a really powerful point about how do you make sure that your leadership is reflecting the diversity of your country. And I'd be interested in your thoughts in how can we both widen, but also shorten the pathway for more diverse leaders to share their unique skills in shaping policy, whether that's domestic policy or foreign policy. What would you recommend?
Well, part of my conversations about this other issue, about whether I was qualified or am qualified, should I be the person selected by Vice President Biden, is reflective of a very critical issue I see, which is that if we can only ever select those who have followed the exact same path, then we are always going to be eliminating viability because we look for typicality. If, for example, if the only person who would be a worthwhile running mate to the vice president is someone who has won statewide office, namely senator or governor, that means that there are only two Black women in American history who've ever been able to be qualified. Carol Moseley Braun and Kamala Harris, both of whom are extraordinary women. But what does it say about a nation when the only two Black women are ever going to meet that standard? I may have become that person in 2018, but it didn't happen, which means right now there's never been a Black woman governor. There have only been two Black women as senators. There have only ever been 15 Black women to win statewide office. And yet, if that is the standard that we hold, it is an impossibility to make progress unless we shift away from using the titles that we use as markers and we instead look at the capacity and the competence as our metric. And that is especially true when it comes to foreign policy. We have to start looking at atypical measures of who could be our leaders abroad, who can participate in foreign service. Right now, I think our foreign service is 2/3 male and 80% white. That is not reflective of America. And if we can only pick those who have gone through the churn of foreign policy development, who knew when they were 18 that this is what they were interested, were able to be admitted to the 12 schools where it's valued, and were able to get through that process, then we are going to find ourselves once again replicating the flaws of the past. And instead, we have this opportunity because our Foreign Service Corps has been so thinned out, because we have lost so much in the infrastructure of foreign policy because of the current president. This is an opportunity for us to actually broaden our understanding of what foreign policy leadership can look like. We can have conversations, not necessarily with folks who have just to the manner born, showed up, but those for whom this is an interest, they are willing to commit themselves and dedicate themselves to the learnings. But it's also critical that when we think about going into places like Europe and places like China and Asia, that we are not simply sending people who we think reflect what we are used to seeing. This notion that white men are the only universal, basically the universal blood type of diplomacy. We have to recognize that the universal blood type of diplomacy is capacity. And that means that we have to evolve not only not devolve our standards, but evolve what we see as the markers and metrics of capacity to do the job.
Mm-hmm. So we're getting questions in from all the folks who are listening, which is wonderful. And I'm just going to remind people that if you want to send us a question, you can either use Twitter, hashtag is Brussels Forum, or you can email us at brusselsforum@gmfus.org. And I'm going to take two of the questions from the queue here, and I'm going to ask them to you together because they're connected. We have one person who is asking, what practical advice do you have for leaders wishing to discuss minority rights within their organizations or with their constituencies? And then we have another listener who's asking, how can America more outwardly and honestly speak to our allies about our struggles in a way that deepens our relationships with them? So there's a question about how do we do this here at home and how do we do it abroad? So over to you.
And I'm going to connect these through the conversation. I referenced earlier the Free Cities Pact that was put together by the four mayors in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland. And they did so because they were deeply concerned about their multicultural communities being overshadowed by the increasingly xenophobic leadership of their presidents. We have a similar challenge here in the United States. We have a similar challenge with autocracy and authoritarianism doing what it always does, which is beginning their devolution into autocracy by attacking minority rights. It is one of the first steps taken by autocrats, because when you can diminish minority rights and when you can turn minorities into the enemy, you create an opportunity for the rest of the country to see itself as the patriots trying to attack this internal enemy. Our responsibility is to not let that stand. And the contrast that's happening in the United States is not only the issue of systemic racism and police brutality, it's the fact that in the middle of Pride Month, the president of the United States and his administration stripped away legal protections in healthcare and housing for the transgender community. It's the fact that the Supreme Court had to step in and guarantee the expansion and coverage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 for the coverage of gender identity and sexual orientation. It was the Supreme Court's responsibility to step in and protect the 700,000 dreamers that the president of the United States wanted to expel from our country. Our conversation about minority rights cannot be held in a vacuum, and it cannot be held from a place of moral superiority. And part of the ability to have this conversation with our leadership, whether it's in a corporation or in a nonprofit or in a government, is that we have to acknowledge that it's insufficient to say you believe it if your actions countermand that statement. And what we have watched happen, unfortunately, for 4 years is a consistent attack on minority rights, while those who are attacking it are celebrating. They say, well, I believe in helping African Americans, while we are removing all of the protections that helped keep police brutality, if not in check, then at least accountable, and creating pathways of responsibility. And so part of our responsibility and part of our pathway is honesty. We have to say aloud what we mean by minority rights. And we have to look for not the macro message, but the micro granular behaviors. If your company does not have minority rights embedded in their value statements, if they do not display it, because yes, you have 2 people who sit on your board, but all of your low wage workers are communities of color and there is no interest in their advancement, then you are not meeting the conversation or the test of minority rights. And social justice has to be more than a buzz phrase. It has to be an active engagement in ensuring that there is actual equality, there is actual justice. And that begins by saying aloud that we see the challenge of minority rights as real. The second part of it is that we have to be honest about the failures that the United States has had. From our inception, we were a nation that did not support minority rights, except for the minority, that 6% of white men who were landowners who were able to vote. Because from our very beginning, the Declaration of Independence, extraordinary document, the Constitution contained deep and abiding flaws. Blacks were not human, Native Americans were invisible, women were to be silent. And from that moment, we have had to claw our way towards equality. We have to be honest about how hard this is. One of our international responsibilities is not to feign that we have solved these problems, but to acknowledge that we are a work in progress, because we know our enemies will use it against us. We have to remember that in the midst of the Cold War, what the Soviet Union did to entice African and Central and Southern American countries into their fold was to point out how painful Jim Crow was, how segregation had limited access for Blacks, and how we were still in the midst of these fights about who was actually an American. As we sent men and women off to die, they came home to a nation that did not respect their citizenship or their humanity. We create propaganda for ourselves when we pretend that we are better than we are, but we can always aspire to be better than we are. And on the foreign policy stage, that's our obligation. Acknowledge our infirmities, but talk about our practices to make it better, and then put them into action.
And I'm going to do a little plug for Brussels Forum, because next week we actually have a conversation with those mayors. So
Yay.
I'm delighted that you've mentioned them a couple of times, because it also demonstrates that both sides of the Atlantic are grappling with these issues. And one of our listeners has a very specific question, and it gets to this overarching issue of, there may be a broad and deep majority of Americans who would agree we've got a problem with policing in the United States. But then the question is, what's the right solution? And this listener is asking, what is your response to the community's calls across the country to defund the police in this moment as a key step toward an anti-racist and anti-violence society? So do you support defunding the police?
I support the vision that is underlying that cry, but I also recognize, as someone who, as Karen aptly pointed out, as someone who travels between activism and policy, I am very intentional about recognizing and respecting the activist language used to not only solidify what they want, but to also give shorthand and to create space for what they envision. Policy has to be both intentional and practical in its way, but it can never lack vision and substance. So I believe in two things. Reformation is one. We have to reform how law enforcement occurs in the United States. And it cannot be these tepid responses that say we have to study it again. The studies have been done through the entire inception and history of our nation. We know what we do wrong. That is not the question. The question is, how do we do it right? And we have practical examples over the last 20 years. We need to ban chokeholds and other forms of lethal force that are not directly tied to how law enforcement officers can control and manage their processes. We have to reduce the use of excessive force and hold people accountable. We have to remove qualified immunity as a shield that protects law enforcement from any accountability for their actions. And we have to do our work to make certain that the training that happens in the United States for law enforcement actually meets international standards. We have one of the lowest number of hours for training required in the world, especially among democratized nations. That must change. And so must the post-training standards, as well as the standard operating procedures of law enforcement. Those are reforms that must be put in place. And there's a litany of them, and we know them, and we have to be willing to do them. At the exact same time, as opposed to in conflict with that, we have to have a transformation of how we view public safety. Today, we view public safety as essentially sending out social workers with guns to meet moments that they are neither equipped nor should they be responsible for meeting. But we also have to address the underlying conditions that make this necessary. Affordable housing, making certain that people have education, investing fully in healthcare, investing in food security. These are fundamental structures that not only create economic and social justice, but they diminish the need for criminal law enforcement. And so when people are talking about the funding of police, there's this notion that it's just about redistributing and reallocating funding. It is a fundamental cry to say that the primacy we give to investing in the law enforcement arm of public safety cannot outmatch the willingness to invest in the public health and public safety part of public safety, meaning that you have a safe place to live, you have the ability to go to school and learn, you have the ability to take care of yourself and your family. And we should redistribute our funding in the United States to give primacy to the things that will fundamentally preclude the necessity for a police officer to be called into a community. That should be a rarity and not the norm. And it is the norm in communities where what happens is that so much money is put into policing that the money is sucked away from education, from healthcare, from housing, from food security, and from the community investments that we know make community stronger.
So I'm going to draw you out a little bit on the changes that you see happening, not only in Georgia, but more broadly in the South. And, there have been various folks who've been saying this is the year that Georgia's going to go blue. And you have talked about, beyond the specific policy changes that there might need to be, you've talked about how you see a new American majority being built in a place like Georgia, but more broadly. And you see it as a coalition of people of color, young people, and moderate to progressive whites. And I want you to share, because this seems to me part of this larger change, maybe, that you are seeing in the United States, and why you do see this moment as different than 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Tell us more about what you call the new American majority and how you see that playing out.
So the new American majority is a demographic descriptor, but it is a reflection of how the policies and infrastructure that we currently exist with either exclude or harm or are directly oppositional to those communities. We have seen, and we know in the United States that by 2040, 2045, we are going to be a majority minority country. But we also know that in the 20 to 25 years between now and then, we are going to have communities that are growing in power, but will not have sufficient power on their own to demand complete change and complete transformation of our society. But we also know that we are the most diverse nation that we have ever been. When I became Democratic leader in 2010 in Georgia, I became leader at a time where we had essentially had a collapse of our party. We lost every statewide office. We lost the Senate to a supermajority, meaning that Republicans could pass constitutional amendments and any other law in the Senate without having a single Democratic vote. And typically in the United States, constitutional amendments require a supermajority of 2/3 to get it done. So they held enough votes. The Democrats did not have participation rights. And in the House, they were fairly close. They were within a handful of votes. That would have created not only one party rule, but super majority rule, which is a very dangerous thing, either in the United States or abroad. At the same time, the caucus that I led was becoming more racially diverse. We were electing people who looked different. I was an African-American woman. I was the first woman to be a leader in the history of the state of Georgia in the General Assembly. I was the first Black person to be a leader in the House. And the fact was that while that was celebrated by some, I was a bit nonplussed that it had taken 200 plus years to get us there. And I say all that to say this. The evolution of our country is being lived first in the South. We are seeing those demographic changes happening at an extraordinary rate at the exact same time that you're also seeing strong tests of conservative policies that have governed these regions and our region in particular for decades. Even when Democrats were in power for 130 years, they were largely conservative Democrats. And what's happening for the first time is a really aggressive and consistent push for more progressive policy. And I use the small p and small c to describe this because conservative policy means to hold to what you have, to reject and to stand in opposition to change. Well, the changes that we need to see for this new American majority are changes that actually include us in the power structure and decision-making of our country, and particularly in the South. We have the highest poverty rates. We have the highest maternal mortality rates. We have the highest incident rates of food insecurity. And so if conservation, if being a conservative means to hold those things in stasis, the new American majority is going to necessarily oppose it. Progress means to expand access to say that we're going to shift those structures that exclude these citizens and these residents from access to the same opportunity that those who are in the conservative space tend to take for granted. I believe that coalition is being built because the numbers of people who now fall outside of that conservative homogeny are beginning to outnumber those who are there. And because we have more people who need more, we're going to have more people demanding more. That's the difference. In 1992 and 1865, in each of those moments, yes, we had a vocal minority that demanded action, but their ability to compel that action was limited by their access to government, by their access to democracy, by their capacity to build a majority to deliver it. They were always reliant upon the goodwill and the grace of those who were in charge. We are finally reaching a point where you don't have to ask people to let you have. You have the ability to use the same levers of power, the same infrastructure of democracy to demand and to create. And that is what is so exciting to me about the new American majority. Georgia is one of those states because we are actually the most racially diverse state in the Deep South, one of the most diverse in the South. And by 2026, 2027, we will likely be a majority minority state. The first one since Reconstruction where the majority of the minority is African American. And that is going to have a seismic effect on how we think about policy, how we think about the future. But it is going to be a terrible thing if it is not built in coalition with other groups, because the worst possible outcome of democracy in a nation of diversity is that a new group rises and decides to impose their needs and their wants on everyone else. We should truly have a cooperative, shared responsibility. And that's what I believe a new American majority can demand.
So it's interesting. We have a question from someone who was an elected official in the United Kingdom. And he's writing from London. And his question is, at this time when the Black Lives Matters movement all over the world has been highlighting crucial issues of social justice, proper policing, inclusion, and democracy, is not the push to remove historic symbols and statues a distraction which just creates more division in the culture wars?
I appreciate the intent of that question, but I would argue that only for African Americans is that ever raised as a concern. That there has never been a moment where there was a declaration as a national good that those who faced the Nazis should have to celebrate Nazism and have it paid for by state funding, that they should have to walk through the city streets confronted by those who fought for the Holocaust. We have never seen in any nation state this celebration and the state funding of those who committed domestic terrorism with the express intent of the dehumanization of a population. It is not a distraction for us. It is a daily fight for us. I grew up in southern Mississippi, and as part of our education, we were taken to the last home of Jefferson Davis. He was one of the presidents of the Confederacy. He had a home in Mississippi called Beauvoir. And when you go to Beauvoir, you see people standing over the graves of slaves, over slave quarters, marveling at the tiny shacks. And I know that they were marveling over the shacks that possibly included my family members, my great-great-grandparents, or my great-great-great-grandparents. And only for African Americans are we told that it is a distraction from our demand for humanity that we not celebrate those who fought to keep us as inhuman and to keep us enslaved. And so I would just question anyone who would and I don't think it's being blithe, but I do think this notion that state-sponsored celebration of dehumanization and asking for it to stop is somehow a distraction. It is core to this narrative, because as long as it is acceptable to celebrate those symbols, for the state to invest in those symbols, for the state to protect those symbols, how then can we believe that the state will protect our lives?
And we unfortunately need to close this conversation, which I found fascinating. And I want to close with a final short question for you, which is, you're a prolific author. I know you're also a voracious reader. So what is the one book that you would wish all Americans would be reading right now?
I hesitate to answer that because I think we're all in different moments of this time, but I would encourage us to read the book that we have avoided reading because it was too uncomfortable to confront those truths. And that's going to be different for each of us. But there's a book that challenges who we are and what we think that people have told us to read. And when we started it, we recoiled because it just was too disconcerting to go in. That's the book you should pick up, and that's the book you should consume.
Well, Leader Abrams, thank you.
And you can read Our Time Is Now.
I thought you were going to say that. I was trying to set you up for that.
I appreciate you setting me up for that, but I actually I'm the daughter of a librarian, so I take book questions very seriously. But Our Time Is Now is available on bookstores today. So.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. Thank you for spending time with me, with all of those who tuned in. We are all smarter for having listened to your wisdom on these topics, and delighted to have welcomed you back to GMF.
It has been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Take care.